Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. So hopefully you have Unity installed now with all the relevant libraries to the type of development that you're wanting to be doing in the future. If you have any problems, you can always hit me up in the Q&A section, or you can directly tweet me if you like. Now, what we're going to be doing next is we're going to open Unity, we're going to sign in, and we're going to have a quick look at the user interface. I'm going to talk you through the different panels that are there. We're going to have a look at the hierarchy, the inspector. We're going to add our first 3D object to the scene, then use the inspector and the tools to rotate and enlarge the 3D object, and basically just get a feel for what Unity looks like and some of the very simple things that you can do with it. Now, if you've already got experience with Unity, by all means, you can skip through this section, but there's always something new to learn, so why not have a look at it and learn something new? So let's open up Unity for the first time and sign in. Now, if for whatever reason your email didn't come through and you haven't been able to activate your account, you can use the skip button down at the bottom here and just proceed to the next screen. But I'll log in under my account. So give me 1 second if I can remember my login information for one of my Unity accounts. Here we go. So once you have started working a little bit with Unity, you actually come to the projects tab. At the moment, I don't have any projects here on the disk or the cloud, so it's taken me straight to the tutorial section. I do think this survival shooter game is worth a download. It's good fun. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to click New up at the top here and create our first project. I'm going to very creatively call my project a new Unity project. We want the setup to be a 3D environment because that's what we're going to be working with. And one of the things that I want to draw a little bit of attention to is the location where you save files. Now, I recently had a hard drive die, and I lost quite a lot of work, but thankfully lots of it was in the cloud, so I was able to retrieve it. Now, I use software called Sync, which is where my current location for Unity files are saved, and I also use Dropbox, which many of you guys might also use. Now, I'd recommend using either Dropbox or Sync or some kind of cloud synchronization software to save your Unity projects, because if what happened to me happens to you guys, it's simply a case of logging into the account on the new desktop, laptop, or hard drive, and then reconnecting that account, and you don't lose any of the files. You can simply download all the projects again and pick up exactly where you left off. What we're going to do is create our first project. Now, bear in mind, mine is the pro account, so mine will look a little bit different to yours. Now, if for whatever reason yours doesn't look like mine, up in the top right hand corner, layout and default, and there we go. We're now on the default view. One of the things that I want to draw your attention to up here in my preferences, the color scheme is here, the editor skin. Now, yours will probably look like this. There we go. And I'm used to using the pro one, so I'm just going to switch that back again, but I just wanted to show you that's pretty much one of the only differences cosmetically that you guys should be seeing. Now, to talk you through it step by step, on the left hand side we have the hierarchy tab. Now, all these areas in grey can be dragged to increase and decrease the sizes. The center area is the scene, and on the right we have the inspector, and each scene has, by default, a camera and what is known as a directional light. So if I just expand the hierarchy, it will show me the items that are on the scene. So inside my world, inside my 3D world. So I can select the camera by clicking once, and here we go, and we get this little preview showing what the camera would see if you were to run this on a device. If I click on the directional light, you also have the directional light and its properties. And to show you how the scene interacts with the hierarchy and inspector, on the left is how we select the items. On the right, when an item is selected, it shows me the elements of the item. So for example, the transform is this X, Y, and Z axis that you can see in the world. Now, to make it a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is add a game object. So we're going to create a cube that appears in the center of the scene, and then when I select the cube, the inspector will show me the properties of that object. So if you go to game object, down to 3D object, and click on cube, that will generate a 3D cube in our environment. And if I go back to the camera, you can now see very small, there's the 3D cube. Now to show you how this works, if I click on the scene with my left mouse button, and then I click and hold my right mouse button, click and drag, and you can move around and look around this scene. Now if I use my mouse button, I can scroll slightly, and then click and drag again, and we can see, if I click my camera, the viewing area here of the camera itself. So in theory, if I click the cube and moved it towards the camera, you'd expect the game preview to make the cube look bigger. And the way you do that is by clicking on the cube, or selecting the cube in the hierarchy, and then manipulating these three axes. Now if I go over the top slightly, you can see that the blue axis, which is the Z axis, acts like a pole going through the cube here. So if I click and drag it, I can move it. And the same works for the X axis, which is a red one. It's like a cube going a pole, going straight through the center of the cube. If I click, I can move it around, and then the Y axis will move it up and down. So in theory, let me just move around a little bit. I'm going to click and drag on the Z to bring it towards the camera, and then click my camera again, and now the preview will show the cube bigger. The same can be done to the camera if I want to move the camera around. You see the game preview changing there, look. We can zoom in and out of this 3D cube. Move it back. Now, if accidentally you move something a long way out of the way and it's totally out of way, the position of where you want it, in the inspector in the right, it shows us the position, the rotation, and the scale of the item that's selected. Now, by default, everything is at 0. So if I change this back to 0, like so, it will actually put the camera back to where the 0 area is on the 3D scene. Now that's where objects appear when you create a game object. It's not actually where the camera was when we first started. The camera was back here somewhere, about there. But that is the 0, 0, 0 destination. Now if I create another game object, for example, a cylinder, and move this to 0, 0, 0, you can see that it moves it back on this grid area here, and that is classed as the absolute center of the 3D world. Now, if I click and move this object around, and click and move this object around, and I want to reset them back, I can select the item and change the values back to 0, or in the top right, there's a cog, and you can click and click reset, and it will put it, all these properties will go back. So let's say, for example, take the cube and reset the cube. There we go. Select the cylinder and just move it slightly out. Now what I want to do is show you how the transform manipulates an object. By clicking the cube, we can see that the X, Y, and Z axes are selected. So imagine a pole going through the center, coming top to bottom on the Y axis here, and then one going straight through this face, through the center and out of the back, and that would be on the Z. Now, to move position, you can click here and drag, and it will do exactly the same on the X-axis, look, the red one, as if I clicked and dragged here. So I'll just reset that. There we go. Now the rotation is on the X-axis. So rather than moving, if there were a pole going through this cube and I were to twist the pole and turn it, then by rotating on the X, you can see the effect that it makes on the cube. It spins on that axis. And likewise, if I just reset that, if I wanted to tilt to the left or to the right on the Y-axis, I could move across to the Y, click and drag, and I could spin the cube on the Y-axis. So it's just like there's an invisible pole going directly through that face and coming out of the bottom of the cube. And every game object can be manipulated this way using these transform tools up at the top. Now, the scale obviously will increase the size. If I wanted to double the size, at the moment you can see the size of the grid here, each unit is 1. The cube is actually scaled to that world unit. It's slightly off on the Y, so I'll just reset it, there we go. But if I were to increase the X and Y and Z by twice as much, there we go. We now have a cube exactly twice the size. You can also click here and drag and manipulate it. And if you really mess it up, just go back and reset the object again, like that. Now, to show you how that would affect the camera, if we click the camera, you can see the size of the cube. I'm going to multiply this by 5, click the camera again, and you can see the size of the cube is increased considerably on the scene. So this is what the transform does. It lets us manipulate the position, rotation, and scale of the selected game object. Now, if the cylinder, for example, went inside, and I were to click off, we can't actually easily select the cylinder again without moving the cube, and if the cube is exactly where I want it, it's a little bit tricky. So that is where the hierarchy comes back into play. I can select the cylinder in the hierarchy, and then I can click and drag just that item. If I want to move 2 items together, there's 2 ways to do that. I can select both, and on the Mac holding Control, Command even, and on Windows you can hold Shift, and then I will have both game objects selected and one transform that will share both the properties. So I can then move both items together. Another way to do that is something called nesting, where one object becomes the child object of another. So for example, here in the hierarchy we have the cube. If I click and drag the cylinder onto the cube, it's now become a child of the cube. So if I were to move the cylinder, nothing happens apart from the cylinder moving, but if I were to move the cube, it would move the cube itself and all its children. So if I had 10 cylinders, all 10 would move when I move the cube. Okay, so what happens if we want to delete an item? If I click on the cylinder, I can simply press Command and backspace on the Mac, or I can click on the cube, right click, and just delete. It's the same pop-up menu on many other applications, so it's quite native to how we normally use software anyway. You can also duplicate a game object if you want to, and it will just duplicate it in exactly the same position. In our case, I'm going to delete it. Okay, so right click, move around, zoom out slightly, and there we go. Now, down at the bottom, we have our project. So if I were to file and save this scene, which is what we're looking at, I'm going to just save it as test. And then I'm going to make sure that it's actually in my sync folder in my assets. Yep, that's exactly where I want it. There we go. It's appeared in my assets in the project panel down at the bottom. Now the project panel will show all my assets that are on the entire application. So it's a good idea to right click and create folders for your different items. So for example, all the scenes, if we had an app where we had a loading screen, we had a menu, the actual game and a high score screen, they would all in theory be individual scenes, and I would put them all together and group them in a folder for scenes to keep things organized. The same goes for any audio files, any images that we import. They'll all appear down at the bottom and be saved in the project. That's the easy way that you can simply reuse assets across multiple scenes. So you can create a button that is, for example, quitting the game, and then we can save that as an asset, and then we can use the quit button across multiple different scenes by simply clicking and dragging it onto the scene or dragging it into the hierarchy, which will do exactly the same and put it back in the scene itself. The only other thing I want to show you in this quick overview are these tools up at the top. Now if I were to create another cube, here we go. We can see the cube is selected as it's appeared in the hierarchy, and here I have the transform position. I'll just reset that back. Whoa, it's jumped away. Scroll out. There we go. Now what I want to show you is, instead of using the transform here and changing the position, rotation and scale, we also have these buttons up in the top left, and they do the same thing. So this is to move the item. So when I click on the cube and this tool is selected, it automatically defaults to move the position. The one in the middle is for rotation, as if you roll over it, shows you rotate the selected object. And to the right, we have the scale. And then if we choose, for example, the movement tool, we can click and move. If we select the center rotation tool, you'll see a globe appear around, and you can see that there are blue, red and green lines. These represent the axis. So if I were to click on the blue, hold it and drag, that would be the Z axis, and then pull down, you can see that if the Z axis were to go from front to back directly through this face, through the center and out of the back, on this Z axis, that's exactly what happens when I pull it around. And if you look to the top right, you can see the rotation on the Z is also changing dynamically. The same goes for if I select the X axis, which is the red one, and I were to click and drag this one. So just to show you two different ways, you can use the transform in the corner, or you can use the tools up at the top. Now this one here affects the scale. So if you click scale, if I just zoom in, you can see a small white cube here. I click and drag, and that will automatically scale the object up and down. Now the only other thing then is the inspector in the top right. I don't want to go too much into detail on these individual components down at the bottom, but this is the area where you can add new components. So for example, if I wanted to create some code which would get the transform and select the rotation, I could use script to automatically increase this number every second, and that would simulate the rotation of this transform automatically. I could then attach that script to this component, so when the game object appears, it will run the code and automatically rotate the cube for me. So we're going to be doing things like that later on. For now though, that's a quick crash course on the hierarchy, the inspector, the project panel, and how you can manipulate a game object using the position, rotation and scale, and the tools up on the top left. So apologies if you're a master Jedi already at Unity and you're just here to do the AR side, but hopefully you've picked up something new either way. Okay, so I'll stop the video now and I'll see you in the next one.